Now we're doing it live. Just delete everything before this. Hey guys, writing a book is really difficult. As many of you probably know by now because a lot of you are my clients. It's a long, slow process. In a good month I can get around 20,000 words in, which is right around 70-ish manuscript pages. But as far as writing speed goes, I don't think there is anyone more infamous currently than my man, George R.R. Martin. It's pretty much gone past a joke now that George R.R. Martin either is writing his new books so slowly that they won't come out until like the next century, or he just plain isn't writing them at all. His last book release was in 2011, which is absolutely wild to think that that's like a full decade ago. At that time, fans expected the next installment, The Winds of Winter, to be out just around 2016. This was for a few reasons. The first was that typically George R.R. Martin took right around 5 to 6 years to write his books. This might seem like a pretty long time to take to write a book, but in actuality, he was writing at a relatively quick pace. That 2011 release, A Dance with Dragons, was just about 415,000 words long. If you break that up over the 6 years that it took to write, that means George was writing at a healthy 70,000-ish words a year. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Savage, didn't you just say you wrote 20,000 words a month? Isn't that like 140,000 words a year? Yeah, it is. My pace of writing is significantly faster than George R.R. Martin's, but for a few specific reasons. First of all, and most importantly, my books are just way smaller than his. My longest novel was right around 190,000 words when I finished it. The shortest book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series is 290,000. My shortest book is 30,000 words, right around like 100 pages. The reality is, it's just plain easier to finish a shorter manuscript than a longer manuscript. The longer your book, the more moving pieces there are, meaning the more difficult it will be to make everything fit together properly. George R.R. Martin writing 70,000 words a year was most likely far more difficult than me writing 90,000 words a year, like I did for my fourth book. He is dealing with a narrative spanning multiple countries, more than a dozen POV characters, and multiple wars. Him writing a chapter and me writing a chapter are not the same. And regardless, George R.R. Martin's pace of 70,000 words a year isn't even bad on its own. 70,000 words is just about the size of the first Harry Potter book, and he did that for nearly 6 years in a row. However, there's another really big reason that people expected The Winds of Winter to be done in 2016. HBO had just committed to adapt the books into a little show called Game of Thrones. You might have heard of it.
Where are my dragons?
The plan was to adapt one book into roughly one season of television each. In 2011, there were 5 books available, which meant roughly 5 seasons worth of content ready to go over the next 5 to 6 years. By the time season 6 would roll around, the idea would be that George would have already come out with The Winds of Winter, allowing the showrunners to simply adapt that novel into season 6 and 7. What nobody expected though, was for the show to absolutely explode as it did. Pretty much overnight, George R.R. Martin became the most famous author in the world. For those that remember, 2011, the year that Game of Thrones started, was the same year that the final Harry Potter movie was released. People were craving a new, big-budget fantasy series to get lost in, and A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones eventually scratched that itch. It was the perfect storm of Harry Potter children becoming adults that paved the way for Martin's meteoric rise in being able to present mature, realistic, interesting adult fantasy fiction. I don't think it's hyperbole at all to say that The Winds of Winter was the most anticipated book in the world for like several years. But that brings us to the sad reality of where we are now. The Winds of Winter did not come out in 2016 when season 6 of the show aired, nor did it come out in 2017 when season 7 of the show aired, nor did it come out in 2019 when season 8 aired. In fact, fervor around the book's release was so high that George R.R. Martin had this quote to give in 2019. "You here have my formal written permission to imprison me in a small cabin on White Island overlooking that lake of sulfuric acid until I'm done. Just so long as the acrid fumes do not screw up my old DOS word processor, I'll be fine." Well, as you can probably tell, Worldcon has come and gone, and in the year 2023, we still do not have the Winds of Winter. As I've said, the circumstances have almost transcended jokes and memedoms. There are entire skits and songs about George R.R. Martin's writing speed, obligations, or lack thereof. But it's not like the man hasn't been writing. Since 2011, he has written multiple books and hundreds of thousands of words of fiction. He has released sample chapters for The Winds of Winter and written entire episodes of Game of Thrones. But the book itself is not finished or released. And apparently, the main reason for this is because it's so dang long. I'm gonna try to do my best to explain the size of this manuscript, but it really is mind-boggling. George R.R. Martin has said that the Winds of Winter manuscript is so massive that it borderline can't be physically bound as a book. Like, the publisher literally would not be able to contain the prospective number of pages in the spine of a book. George R.R. Martin has been on record saying that it'll be the biggest book he's ever written. And believe it or not, he's run into this exact problem before. When he wrote A Dance with Dragons originally, it was so big that George R.R. Martin had to split it into 2 books to get it published. The book that contained the first half was titled A Feast for Crows and clocked in at 300,000 words. The second half was eventually released as A Dance with Dragons at 415,000 words itself. So yeah, originally he wrote somewhere in the ballpark of a 700,000 word book. That would have been one of the largest books ever released in the modern era. Reasonably, we can expect The Winds of Winter to be somewhere in the 500,000 to 700,000 word ballpark, maybe more. And this is really where we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, because as a fantasy author myself, my mindset on George's writing of this book is probably a bit different than the general public's. Is it pretty strange that it's taken him 12 years and counting to finish a book that isn't even the final entry in his series? Yeah. Is it super strange that the show basically spoiled and ruined his eventual plan for his narrative, essentially killing off the hype for the books before they were even released? Yeah, that's like a living hell for an author. But I'm gonna let you know something. I kinda get it. I kinda get why he's taking so long. And the reason why I get it is because I have somehow found myself in a similar boat. See, back in 2019, I finished my 5th book in 4 years. That 5th book is entitled Imperious and is not yet available on my website, but I'm crossing my fingers that it will be soon. Just, keep looking out. But this 5th book, Imperious, has special significance to me. The only reason I ever even started writing novels in the first place was because of Game of Thrones. And the only reason I ever started watching Game of Thrones was because of the dragons.
Where are my dragons?
Dragons are my all-time favorite aspect of fiction. It's really not that close. If you watch the main channel, you know this by now. So with that being said, it's kind of incredible that I wrote 4 full fantasy books without dragons in any of them. Don't get me wrong, I love all my books. They're my babies. Heck, I wrote a mafia book where an old Irish mob queen trains a 12-year-old boy to become her criminal mastermind heir. But it didn't have dragons in it. So I decided my 5th book would have dragons in it, and I wrote it. It ended up being just about 115 pages, 40,000 words, and was about a guard who becomes best friends with his prisoner while traveling across the country with a young Drake. It's basically a shonen manga written into a fantasy novel. It's just dudes and dragons fighting, being bros, and bonding. But whenever somebody read it, I would always get the same question. When is the sequel coming? So for context, Imperious is a prequel to my first book. In fact, it takes place 100 years prior to the events in the first book. And the 2 dudes at the center of it, the guard and the prisoner that become friends, go on to become the emperor and second in command by taking over an entire continent. They're incredibly famous, lore-worthy figures in the first book that basically changed the world across their lives. But in the 5th book, they're just like dumb 20-year-olds traveling through a forest. But the expectations of my readers was always, when do we get the story of them taking over the empire? Which was funny for me because in my mind, that book was never going to be, actually written. I didn't have a plan for the sequel to my guilty pleasure, but if other people really wanted it, who was I to deny them? So I started working on that sequel. I had it made up in my mind that it was going to be a story of the war, told just around 90,000-ish words, about the size of my 4th book. But that was in 2019. Since then, 4 years later, you'll be proud to know that I am just over 60% done with that book. And I'm at 182,000 words, over double my original full estimate. My page count is sitting at 564 right now. This is easily going to be the largest book I have ever written, probably totaling somewhere around 300,000 words and 900 pages. You're probably asking yourself, Savage Books, how did this happen? It's a bunch of stuff that happened inside the book and a bunch of stuff that happened outside the book. Let's handle the inside the book stuff first. The 2 main characters of this book are named Derek and Carver. After the events of the first book, they become best friends, and my plan for the sequel was to have them overthrow the tyrannical emperor to save their homeland. But in doing so, I realized that writing an entire medieval war novel is really complicated. There's a lot to consider, one of which being, who are Derek and Carver's allies in the war? I didn't know. I hadn't thought that far. I really didn't when making the book. But it would make sense that if they did have allies, that would probably come through marriage. That's kind of how like the medieval world works. You marry people and then you get in contracts and pacts and alliances and whatnot. Derek and Carver were 2 prominent young noble warriors, so they'd probably get married. This meant I had to create an entire section of the book where they met their eventual wives and convinced them to wed. But that's kind of like boring on its face, so I had to make sure that the wives had their own motives for the war, meaning twists, turns, betrayals, battles, and all the good stuff that readers like. And when that was done, I realized I needed to show Derek and Carver getting support for their rebellion. So I created an entire section of the book where they meet with other nobles, radicalize them into rebels, and take down those seeking the throne for power. But then I realized, hey, the whole reason I even started writing these books in the first place was for dragons! So I created another section of the book where Derek finds and permanently reclaims the young Drake from the first book now that it's a grown, full-size dragon. But then I realized I actually have to show the war part of the war, where armies are clashing and battle tactics are needed. The war itself needed to come off as actually difficult and costly. So I then created an entire arc with huge battles, victories, and deaths spanning across multiple regions. So every time I had one of these realizations, it was 30,000 words here, 40,000 words here, until before I knew it, I was at 200,000 words basically, with a ton more to go. But even then, that doesn't really even explain why it's taken so long. If I write 20,000 words a month, shouldn't I have gotten through 200,000 words in 10 months, not 4 years? Well, this is where we get into the stuff happening outside the book. After I started this book in 2019, my YouTube channel blew up. Then my editing business blew up. Then my master's program got a lot harder. Then I got into a relationship, and. So many different things started taking up my time in the day because they became just as important to me. I had other business ventures to look into, other obligations to fulfill. So it significantly slowed down my pace of writing. Not to mention that with a longer book, it just takes more time to get feedback from beta readers, which means longer times to wait and longer times to edit. There were whole months at a time where I was just waiting for feedback. But really, this is all to say that the current book I'm working on, which will end up being larger than any other book that I've written, it'll be larger than the first 3 Harry Potter books combined. It isn't even in the same ballpark of complexity or size when compared to what George R.R. Martin is doing. He is currently writing possibly the most intricate, sprawling, and anticipated novel of the 21st century. And he's been doing it while being far more famous and scrutinized than he ever wanted, while writing scripts for Game of Thrones, while writing books, while consulting on House of the Dragon, while going on book tours and talks, while consulting on video games like Elden Ring, while trying to just live his life. It's taken me 4 years to write 180,000 words. That's 45,000 words a year. At this rate, it would have taken me 10 years to write A Dance with Dragons. It took him 6, and that book is shorter than The Winds of Winter will be. Believe me, no one is more critical or frustrated with themselves than George about this whole situation. He wanted to have been done with this book in 2015. Does it suck as fans that we still don't have it in our hands? Absolutely. Is George R. R. Martin terrible at estimating the speed of his own writing and should probably stop giving updates on when to expect it? Absolutely. But taking 12 years to write what is probably going to be a 1,500-page tome that will possibly be the defining manuscript of an entire generation of fantasy readers, honestly 12 years is pretty reasonable. He clearly doesn't want it done fast, he wants it done right. And as someone writing their own version of an epic fantasy that has become way too long, I completely understand. So that's the end of today's video. Honestly, it was kind of just a mini rant and some thoughts that I had, and I guess an update about where I've been, what I've been doing in the background of these videos. I have been slaving away working on both my editing projects for my clients and this book for myself. So if you guys like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you'd like to talk about next. There's some movies that come out recently that I think I will dive into. But as always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.